Welcome, everyone, to our end of course live event for Design Thinking for Leading and Learning. We're thrilled to be able to have you all here. And I'm thrilled to have Lisa Habiger. Did I pronounce that right?
Yes.
Excellent.
Okay.
From the Colegio Nuevo School. Did I do that right?
Granada, yeah. The American school, we can call it, in Colombia.
Seeing you in Bogota, Colombia. So thank you so much for joining us, Lisa, and super excited to hear more about sort of what you learned throughout the course and how you're translating some of those things into your work as a full-time teacher librarian and with your two makerspaces there. For those of you who are watching live, please introduce yourself and say hello in the chat window. So we see that Nicole and John are here, and anybody else who's around, please introduce yourself. And as we go along, if you have questions or if you have thoughts that you want to throw in, please do so. It's very informal, just a chance to kind of celebrate some of the learning that we've done together and to reflect on what we want to do moving forward. So and for those of you who are watching this afterwards, thanks for joining us. If you watch it on the YouTube page, you should be able to not only see the video, but also a record of the chat as it happened during the live event. So a few things. The course will end on April 25th at 11:30 p.m. UTC. If you're hoping to earn a certificate, you have to complete 60% or more of the assigned work and indicate that by filling out all the appropriate completion checklists by the course end date in order to pass the course and earn a certificate. If you haven't yet, please take the post-course survey. That is super helpful to us in getting feedback about how we want to change and improve the course in future runs. And then the next course that we are going to run starts on May 2nd, and it's called Envisioning the Graduate of the Future. And it's an exercise in guiding conversations about graduate profiles. And so for folks who are thinking about where they want their schools to end up and what directions they want them to be able to go, thinking a little bit about your students is an incredibly helpful way of doing that. So let's get right into it, sort of chatting with Lisa. Lisa, could you just tell us a little bit about sort of what your role is in your school, what kind of school it is, and maybe is one way, one thing that you've been working on this week to give us a sort of introduction to the kind of work that you do.
All right, thank you, Justin. I am currently the teacher librarian here at Colegio Nuevo Granada in Bogota, Colombia. I've been here now 9 years. I work with grades 6 through 12, 900 students, and on top of the teacher librarian role with integrated information skills, information literacy skills, and research, with the regular teachers in grades 6 through 12, I also have the two maker spaces that we started a few years ago. So yeah, it's really busy over here.
What inspired the creation of the maker spaces? How did that get started?
Well, I've been a teacher all my whole life or a librarian. And maker spaces are huge in libraries, especially public libraries, as a way to keep attracting clients. So I was super interested in it, and I did a lot of reading. I knew we didn't really have a space for them when I started thinking what I was going to do. So I kind of just put out a stop motion station, Lego station, and some other things, little bits and whatnot about the library, and just to see how it went. Then the next year we had a computer lab open up, so all the desktops went out, and I thought, and it's in my area of supervision, so I'm like, I'm taking that over. Mm-hmm. And we started out with junk, iPads and Legos, and it's evolved quite nicely in the last 3 years. Now we have 2. So we took over another former computer lab. So it's been great, yeah.
And do classes kind of sign them out for a period of time? Like if I was a teacher and I wanted to do a makerspace project, or are kids assigned like a maker class somehow? How do kids make their way into the space?
Well, when we started, I thought for sure I'd have to drum up business. I thought I'm going to have to grab kids, in their free time and entice the kind of teachers I knew would be interested in, like, see what I could do. But in actual fact, when we started, it went great guns straight off the mark. Mm-hmm. And we're jammed we hardly do any like fun extracurricular things. There are some kids who like to spend their lunch hour and so on in here and after school, but mostly it's integrated into the regular curricula of the various grade levels.
What's a project or an integration coming up that you're particularly excited about? Like, what's the next really fun thing that's going to happen in the makerspace?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, we have one that a high school physics teacher and an English teacher are collaborating on. The
Cool.
English class read the graphic novel Watchmen.
Uh-huh.
The physics teacher is working on transfer of energy. So what they're going to do is do some close reading and like character analysis in English, and then they're going to design a device that can be used by that character to solve some sort of a problem. So for the physics end of it, she's working on energy. She wants it to work with some kind of a transfer of energy. So that looks to be like an interesting upcoming project.
That's great. That's very cool. It's like an ideal graphic novel because the heroes, for the most part, are not people with like completely unimaginable superhuman powers, but they're sort of like clever, devicey kinds of folks. So that seems great. That seems like a really fun sort of interdisciplinary project to have going on there. How did you encounter this course? What got you excited about taking a course called Design Thinking for Leading and Learning?
Well, I've done a lot of reading on my own of design thinking, Mary Cantwell's stuff, the D School, Dan Ryder's Wicked Decent, and the book he and Amy Revelle published. So I've done a ton of reading, but I feel like the old Pong game, if you're old enough to remember that, where it's a ball that just bounces around. So I had a lot of balls bouncing around in my head, but I couldn't really get traction to think like, okay, really, what do we need to do here, and how can I move things forward in a really positive and exciting way. And I get a lot of emails, and I received an email about this course, and I thought, I think this is going to help me out, and it did.
Good. Give you some structure for working on some things and reading about some things with other people that you're kind of already working on anyway.
Yes.
That's terrific. Yeah, that's really cool. So why don't you did a project for each of the 2 units. Do you want to talk a little bit about either one? We can start with either one. Maybe just start with the Unit 2 project. What was the sort of challenge or problem of practice that inspired the project, and what kinds of things did you do? Give a little summary for folks who haven't encountered it in the forums.
Right. So the challenge of Unit 2 is to pick a stage in the design thinking cycle and think of creative ways to kind of introduce it and get kids used to it. So I picked prototyping because I thought I'd have a good chance of trying out some ideas. So that seemed like a good thing to choose. I actually struggled. I'm a lifelong tinker and maker myself, so I have lots of experience on my own of making stuff. But I really struggled. I think I was in too much of a gnag mode, where there's like full process. And I had a little bit of trouble kind of breaking out and thinking, well, you can't just focus on one piece of the design cycle. But it was a little bit challenging for me. I had a lot of really lame ideas. And I just kind of wrote them down. I thought the creative constraints of the assignment in terms of time for brainstorming, X number of minutes and so on, that was really helpful to sort of break out of my, writer's block or designer's block or whatever you want to call it, because it kind of gave me permission to go ahead and write those kind of lame ideas down and get them out of my head. And then it's like, well, you only have 10 minutes it's not like the best idea ever thought of, but it's the best idea, that could be thought of in 10 minutes.
Yep.
Sort of liberating, I guess. So yeah, I like Post-its. I think the colors are really inspiring, and I like the way you can kind of move them around. So I often will use Post-its. So I just wrote down a lot of, you can see that some of them aren't very good ideas, on the Post-its, and kind of changed them around. And somewhere in there I had the epiphany of, well, you can't prototype based on nothing. They're going to have to do some imagining and brainstorming beforehand. So I added that in. And then I thought, I was kind of struggling with like the idea of like a menu of activities. That's not such a good idea. Then I thought, I can incorporate prototyping into so many different areas, and co-plan and co-teach with the classroom teacher. And it'd be really cool to have some of the activities kind of not super specific, so that you could use them over and over again. For example, One idea was prototyping some kind of a 3D representation of the character. You could use bottle caps and, I don't know, straws, junk, string, beads, glitter, whatever it was that could represent maybe a fantasy character or someone in history or something. And it's open-ended enough that you could use it kind of over and over again, which I thought would be useful, to kind of have a cache of quickies that you can try. Storyboarding, isn't super innovative. I think a lot of people do that. But yeah.
No, but I mean, even if things aren't innovative, it sounds like what you did was sort of think about a part of your practice that you thought could be beefed up, and then you sort of brainstormed some particular ideas and sort of came up with, okay, so if we wanted to ramp up there being more prototyping that was happening, here are just a sort of couple of go-to exercises that in your context where you're supporting lots of teachers doing lots of different things, you could sort of propose, here are kind of a set of genres for prototyping in that you could help people, that token and the storyboard, that would help them get started. And then you tested these with a couple of different classes of students?
Yes. It's interesting. The empathy token, it's not the empathize, it uses that, but it wasn't directed at that part of the design cycle. The sixth graders had just finished a unit on social justice, so they'd done a lot of reading and empathizing already, and they had really researched whatever social justice issue they were into. And the week we did that, which was 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, we had a flu epidemic here. So the sixth grade teacher showed up, the English teacher showed up in the library like, I don't know what to do. I only have 8 kids or whatever it was. I said, well, let's do a makerspace activity. So we started talking, and she, explained that she was finishing up this unit, and I'm like, okay, well, how if we, I threw out the totem idea. Let's, I could build a little 3D totem of whatever. She said, I want them to empathize, like to talk about how important empathy is.
Yeah.
And so I said, all right, because I had been thinking of doing a coin for a historical figure, and that didn't work out. I'm like, we could make tokens. And it was a 1 day, 1 period in her classes. And it was great. We went through the whole design cycle. I mean, they had a lot of background knowledge already because they've been studying social justice and talking a lot about empathy. But it was great.
So it's very similar to Facing History in Ourselves is an organization that does work on the Holocaust, Reconstruction, other sort of the Armenian genocide, sort of other terrible things that happen in history. And they study issues of identity, and then they study the sort of historical kind of sources of a conflict and try to make sense of a conflict. And they usually have a unit on kind of memorialization. How do people remember the past, especially parts of the past that we're not particularly proud of? Although there are always heroic people who act and do extraordinary things in that moment. So there's a sort of connection there of taking something somewhat abstract, like empathy and social justice, and saying, okay, so what does that look like to try to make that material? What are sort of representations of that, which in fact is a challenge that comes up, in real societies all the time. How do we want to remember and represent things that are important to us, but are sort of complex feelings? Another thing I really like around that story, I just think a good disposition to have is one of the things at doing more of this design thinking work, I've sort of realized how the sort of reticence that teachers often have to sort of testing and trying things. Like teachers will often sort of build a lesson or a unit and then do the whole thing with their kids for a few weeks. Whereas designers are often trying to say like, no, like don't put the whole thing in the field first. Like try what's the fastest way you can prototype some part of this? I just love the part of your story of like, there are 8 kids and the class period is kind of run amok, but like, don't send them to study hall or like, let them do free reading. Like, here's a thing that we've been thinking about trying. Let's use them. Get them engaged, have them try some things, and then that's going to give us some useful feedback to figure out like, is this a good strategy to build in future units or other things like that? I think At first glance, teachers are so enormously busy, it feels like there's sort of not time to prototype and test and try things. But then you start realizing that there are all of these kind of discretionary times that show up all throughout the year. And if you're prepared to take advantage of them to do some testing and prototyping, that's great. So you're prototyping units about prototyping. I think that's terrific.
Yeah, which is cool. And you know, the best part of those periods a couple of weeks ago was the kids. I had the teacher created the interview questions, and they interviewed each other, and they created the token for the user, the other person. And the best part of the whole thing was their interviews. They were amazing. You know, they'd given a lot of thought to empathy and social justice, and they were so deep, and their answers were just incredible. And the other thing I liked about that project is that we were able to just cut the tokens with their handwriting and drawing.
Yeah.
And I think that made it was faster, first of all, for us to do with the laser cutter, but it just added sort of this hominess and, I don't know, warm, fuzzy feelings with it. It was in their little handwriting.
That's great. Are there resources? So one of the questions that we often like to ask in these conversations is to try, and it's in some ways a sort of feedback question for us. As you think about this thing that you implemented in your class with a colleague, what were the resources in the design thinking for leading and learning MOOC that you feel like were most helpful in preparing you, inspiring you, helping you do this? Like, what are the learning experiences that were baked into the course that you feel like, oh, you know, these were one or two or three things that really were helpful to me as I'm bringing some of these new ideas to life?
Well, I think the course sort of pulled what I'd been thinking about, reading about kind of together. And I think really going through the whole process myself with the projects is super useful, because, you know, you can think about it, you know, like if we would, but until you actually do it, you know, again, the creative constraints, I think that's so important. The videos, watching you and your colleagues talk, was very helpful, and also the schools that were available, you know, with their chats online and their talks. It just kind of all came together for me, and I think I just feel more confident. I didn't really think I was doing design thinking so much, you know, not very well, or I don't know. I felt like I had to really be you or someone at the D school, you know, someone really special to do design thinking. So I think that the experience of going through the courses and doing the assignments and getting all the feedback was really helpful, most especially for my confidence.
That's terrific.
The thing I think was I have been under the impression that prototyping has to be something amazing. Like that seventh graders are going to come out with, you know, fully functioning wind machines.
Yeah.
Right. So that one video where a few people were talking about, you know, it's the process, right? It's not the end product. The process and the thoughtfulness that goes into the process and the iterations are really what's important. I'm like, well, yeah, of course. Of course that's what's important. And that also, you know, passing that on to others, even after a couple of weeks from the course, you know, I feel like I could talk about that more intelligently with some experience behind it, and I think that's really helped too.
That's great. You know, your comment about doing things yourselves reminds me of, I had a chance a number of years ago to visit High Tech High, which is a school that does great project-based learning kinds of experiences. And one of the things that I sort of remember most about that was the art teacher, who is the founding art teacher there. You know, every time a group came and visited his classroom, he would like look very deeply into their eyes, you know, like, I have something important I'm about to tell you now. And it was, do the project. Like, if there's something that you're imagining you're going to have students do for a bunch of weeks, do it yourself first, because you will learn all kinds of things about what works and what doesn't by incorporating those thoughts into that. This is great. I'll keep asking some more questions if there are folks in the chat window who apparently are coming from all over the world. We're thrilled to have folks from Rwanda and Nigeria and Algeria and Quito and all other places, the West Coast, Michigan. So thanks for joining us. If you have questions or things you want to hear more about, that would be great. Why don't we talk a little bit about your Unit 3 project, because that was something else that you did that was sort of less about the classroom, more about a kind of whole school experience. Can you tell us a little bit about what the challenge was you were tackling, and what you did in the class that sort of helped you work on that?
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, we have the 2 makerspaces, and I'm a full-time teacher librarian, so I'm not the makerspace person. I have 2 assistants who are great. They know how to run all the equipment, and they can be really helpful to kids. But there's not a teacher in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so for no one's fault other than I just didn't plan thoughtfully how that it would be so successful. It kind of got away from me in a great way because it's a great problem to have.
Mm-hmm.
People are coming to the maker spaces that now we have to rein in things like safety protocols. You know, we can't just pass out box cutters to everyone. We got to like have a little more thoughtfulness to that. And also the kind of we're missing out, or I'm missing out, and others who want to work with me in the makerspace, we're missing out on that really critical kind of planning time with teachers. Like some get it, they're great, but they don't know what we have in here because it's a purpose-built space, so the stuff is in closets, and unless you know, you don't pull out everything. You don't dig around and find everything. So that was one thing. But also for those who aren't maybe experienced with any kind of maker activities, sometimes they go a little off course, like everyone makes a pot, for example. Well, if everyone has the same solution at the end, it's probably not a maker project.
Yeah.
Good intentions, but not enough interaction with people who could be helpful. Sometimes, the lesson plans we don't even get. We don't really know what they're doing and all that kind of stuff. So I realized that I needed to really think through this before next school year. And when this came up, Unit 3 with the bigger challenge, working it with a systemic problem, that one is one I've been thinking about already. So it was a great reason, to do that. So yeah, we're making a lot of progress already. I met with my direct supervisor, the high school principal. She's really great. She's a tech lover, and she was director of educational technology, among other things. So she's super interested in making and collaborating the 4 C's of 21st century learning into everything the high school does.
Yep.
So she's been really helpful, and we've kind of reworked a lot already, and we'll keep kind of revising our plan and coming up with better ways to implement it. But it was super helpful.
What kind of, I mean, it sounds like part of what you're developing in your final project is like, here are some protocols and procedures for using the makerspace. Here's how we can get people more familiar with our expectations and those kinds of things. In what ways have you thought about developing those kinds of things through a sort of iterative cycle of imagining, prototyping, developing, trying? Like, what are some of the sort of what are the ways that you're trying to bring design thinking into this challenge of having a makerspace which is more widely and appropriately used across the school?
Well, one thing that's come out is through my discussion with my principal. She has had several high school teachers express interest in participating quite a bit in the makerspace, not as a teacher necessarily, although that as well, but in terms of like a coach, I guess.
Yep.
So that I didn't know until I started working on this plan, and that's been great because I've sent off the link to the course to a couple people because I think it's important that we all have more or less the same, north.
Yeah. Shared language.
Yeah. So I have that, and I've discussed it with quite a few people. Hey, we have these problems. What do you think? And I think that process will become a little bit more formalized. So we'll have more intentional get-togethers with an intentional, purpose and so on. So in that way, we'll be working and iterating and on the plan. But it's been really helpful already because when you're all by yourself thinking in a vacuum.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you're all geared up to have some more people do some imagining and do some brainstorming with you, and it'll be cool to sort of figure out how you can take some of those new ideas, try some new things, see how they're working, use them to keep iteratively improving what you're doing. Throughout the course or throughout these projects you've been working on, has there been anything that was like particularly unexpectedly challenging or sort of unexpectedly enlightening? Were there any surprises in your learning as you were going through?
You know, I had an aha moment when I was watching one of the videos where I don't remember the person, but they were talking about if you've written a lesson plan, taught the writing process, worked with the scientific method, come up with a makerspace activity, you're doing design thinking. I'm like, oh, I'm okay. Obviously I could do it better, oh, all right. But it was weird because I've been teaching for 30 years and it was still difficult to kind of overlay design thinking process with, lesson planning and the kind of stuff I do. I don't know why it was so hard for my mind to like break out of its gnag or whatever, but I had a little trouble with that.
One thing that we talk about a lot is that oftentimes the way we describe what we do in teaching and in lots of other things is as a linear process. So they'll come in at the beginning of the year, and then they will do unit 1, and then they will do unit 2, and then they will do unit 3, and then we'll be done. I know I'll plan unit 2 while I'm doing unit 1, and things sort of proceed stepwise. And I do think that one of the biggest shifts that design thinking, engineering design approaches call upon is more of this sort of innovation through iteration, these sort of cycles of development and change, where you say, actually, before you do unit 2, take 3 really important pieces of unit 2 and have some people try them. Take them and show them to your colleague, and do them yourself. Have your colleague try to do them. Ask 2 kids to hang out in your class during lunch and to do it with you. If a bunch of kids are sick and you have a free period, take one new thing that you're trying to do and get folks to test it. That I think that's it's definitely, none of it is rocket science, and it's not kind of radically different from what's done before. But I do think that is one structural difference, is that it is not intuitive in teaching to think of innovation through iteration, especially since there's kind of a natural arc of a year towards the work that we do over a course of a whole school year. Whereas in lots of engineering things, one of the things people have learned is increasingly trying to get that like natural arc time span down to like 4 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, these sort of short iterative loops we can try, improve, cycle, and get better.
I think, I must say, when you teach 4 periods in a day, you iterate on the fly, right? Because they're like, ooh, that didn't go so well.
I've got to try this in some kind of different way. One of the questions that we ask in the course towards the end is, I used to think, but now I think. What was your I used to think, but now I think for this class?
I used to think design thinking is for brainiacs at MIT and the D School and all those really amazing people on Twitter or whatever. And now I think I can do it, and you can do it, and we can do it.
Yeah. That is actually just a way of thinking about solving problems that's widely accessible and actually draws on a lot of the things that people are already working on. If we were to run the course again, do you have any feedback for us? What kinds of things would you like to see differently or see added to the course? What do you wish you could either learn more about or thought we could have done differently or done better?
Well, I like the course a lot. I think ways to incorporate in the empathy, the empathizing, because a lot of times, at least those of us who work, in middle school, high school, we're not going to, well, actually, that's not true. In some cases, our kids have gone out and solved problems, world problems and so on. But, how do you work that stage into regular stuff? Like, you may not be able to contact a village, in the Guajira, in the coast of Colombia, and find out what their problems are, and work with them and so on. So that was a little bit challenging for me to kind of break out of that. You got to have like a big, real client to talk to about the problem, to empathize. So actually Dan Ryder's stuff, where he gets into empathizing with characters, and Mary Cantwell's empathy map, I think kind of put me on the right path for that. But that would be really cool to maybe have some chats going about that, because I think that's really challenging in regular teaching, following regular curriculum. And also assessment is big.
Yep.
Yeah, that would be great to have a little chat going about assessment. There was one on Twitter, during the MIT Twitter chat, and that was helpful. But that's always super challenging.
What in particular for you is challenging about assessment?
Well, it's not just me. It's me and the teacher who's going to be required, to provide formative and summatives. Middle school is easier. I feel like they have a lot more flexibility in what kind of assessments they give, and I can think of 5 or 6 to do, with the project. High school is more challenging. I think, for whatever reason, they just feel more. We have a lot of AP classes, first of all, so they feel super locked into certain kinds of assessment.
Yep.
And shifting, the mentality from the product, like a rubric for the end product, like an essay or whatever it is, a diorama or whatever, to trying to wrangle the assessment of the process. I think for me, I don't give grades.
Yeah.
Sometimes I participate in the grading, projects and so on, but generally it's the teacher who's assigning the grades, who's responsible for the grades, who's going to talk to the parents at the teacher conference for grades. And so for them, I think that's really, really challenging to kind of shift the mind from product to process. Yeah, and I don't know, tons about that. I'm always interested.
Yeah. No. The assessment is where school practices and like conservative traditions and school bureaucracy kind of all collide into one another. I have a colleague, YJ Kim, who's doing a project with MakerEd out in Oakland, California, to try to design essentially what you're describing, a sort of set of process rubrics or process formative assessments that can help folks address some of those kinds of problems. So that would be a neat thing to add to future courses, and certainly an exciting line of work to be working on. Well, Lisa, it's been wonderful getting a chance to chat with you for half an hour. It would be great to let's see if there's a couple of chats. We have John Aubrey maybe has one last question for us in the chat window, which is the process of design thinking just a collection of competencies? For me, design thinking is a sort of flexible set of problem-solving strategies. Probably each of those problem-solving strategies kind of has some competencies amongst them. If there's a kind of competency to it, if there's something which sort of transcends kind of above the level of discrete competency, it's this intuition that the way to solve problems is by engaging deliberately in this cycle of trying to understand a problem space, trying to generate some prototypes, trying to put those prototypes, at their sort of smallest possible stage into the world, building on them and sort of growing around that. And I think that's in contrast to a lot of how we think about solving problems, which is typically a more linear, like, okay, I'm going to imagine, a range of solutions, and then I'm going to pick one of them and I'm going to build it all the way out and kind of see how it goes. There's certainly things within that are a competency, but a lot of it, I think, is, I probably describe more as a disposition, the idea of seeing like, the way to solve this problem, whatever it is, to find this problem is by, sort of imagining these kind of tight iterative loops to really think about, to start not first from the problem as much, but to start from sort of problems and problem finding. And it sounds like that's sort of, one of the big challenges the challenge that you describe in your work of sort of figuring out like, well, where do those big problem finding real world problems sort of fit? It's definitely one that we certainly have at MIT as well. If you ask students how they spend most of their time at MIT, they're usually in their courses given sets of things to work on, told, all right, this is in fact, we had one student who was working as an undergraduate in our lab around the time we were working on design thinking, and he said something along the lines of, our instructors almost always give us problems to solve and then we figure out how to solve them. It's much more rare to say like, okay, go find the problem that's out there. But that's a lot of what life is. It's certainly the most interesting problems to solve are not always the ones that are handed right to you. Terrific. Well, this has been a super helpful conversation and a great way to sort of celebrate the end of the course. I want to thank all of you who are watching online right now, as well as those of you who are in some future time and space watching along with us. As a reminder, please do fill out, if you're planning on getting a certificate in the course, fill out your competency checklist so you can get credit for it. The course will remain, it'll stay open as long as we can possibly convince all the stakeholders around here to keep it open and freely available. So Lisa, it's great to hear that you're sharing it with others, and we certainly encourage other folks to do so. All the material in the course is available under a Creative Commons license, at least all the stuff that we created. So as you're working with other faculty or other kinds of things like that, would encourage you to take things out of them and share them and put in your own professional development resources for others. We imagine these courses as resources, not just for the people who are learning within them, but for you all to take them and to share them with others. And then we hope lots of you will join us starting May 2nd for Envisioning the Graduate of the Future. So Lisa, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I hope you have terrific success with your makerspaces for the rest of the year.
Thank you. My pleasure, Justin.
And for all of you online, thanks so much for joining us. Have a terrific afternoon.